Hello, I am Holly. I'm a web developer, and I actually started out in a completely different industry, and I just learned to code from scratch on my own. I didn't take any courses to learn. I didn't go to a boot camp. Um, I I just kind of Googled my way into an entirely new career. And over the years, I've had a handful of people ask me how I did all of that. Sometimes they're asking for tips, sometimes they're just curious. And um, the truth is just I Googled a lot, but that feels like a really weak answer. Even though it is the truth, I know how to code because I Googled a lot. It just kind of feels like a cop-out answer. And after some conversation with my girlfriend about exactly this topic, I realized that there's a few things that at the very beginning I didn't even know to Google. And, I didn't know, oh, I need to do this, I need to do that. And so I wanted to make a quick little video just talking about those things and digging in so that hopefully if you are learning to code for the very first time, you don't feel like you're completely in the dark. And, hopefully this can be a little bit of a guide. This isn't going to be a video that will teach you how to code, just kind of like give you some places to start and some things to do if you're learning and you're just kind of like overwhelmed and kind of thrown out to sea. So yeah, hopefully this is a little bit of a guide there for you. Yeah. One of the first places to start is deciding what language that you want to learn. There's a million out there. Do not take this chart home as like the end all be all of what you need to know for each thing. This is just kind of like a guide, and generally what I've used as I've like dipped my toes into each of these categories. It's a place to start. I would say like the most important thing is you start kind of in the right area, but you don't have to start in the right, the perfect language to start with. There's no such thing. There's some things where like I would say if you want to learn React, you need to learn JavaScript first, of course. React is an extension of JavaScript. So React JS being JavaScript, you want to start with JavaScript. But as far as like, do I learn Java or do I learn JavaScript? And yes, those are very different. Do I learn Python or JavaScript? I don't know. And it doesn't really matter. You can pivot at any time. Having learned JavaScript and started there and then realizing later, well, no, I actually want to do video games, I'm going to switch over and learn C++ or C#. You can totally do that at any time, and there's nothing stopping you from doing that. So this is just kind of like if you're confused on where to start, this is a very quick thing like, oh, I want to build video games. Okay, then you should start with probably C++ or C#. But it's not the only thing you're going to use in that area, nor is it the only thing you'll ever need throughout your whole career. And if you decide, I don't want this, I want to do something else, you can always switch at any time. This is just like if you're just starting out and you have absolutely no idea, just grab one, and that's something. The most important thing is to not feel stuck, right? Like we don't want to be stuck like, well, I don't even know where to start, super overwhelming when there's like millions of languages out there. Just grab one, and it doesn't matter which one, and it's okay at the end of the day. Like at least you're doing something. If you're doing something, then you're going to get where you need to be eventually. It will happen eventually. We'll get there. There will be a lot of stumbling, but the important thing is to just grab something and start. So you can use this, or you can do some Googling on your own. Like, I want to learn XYZ. What language should I learn? Like, what, you might Google what programming language for, phone app. If you actually Google that, you're going to get a lot more than just Java and Python. I just wanted to put very simple things on here so that, like, there's nothing too overwhelming. There's obviously a million languages you can pick from. So this is an overly simplified chart. If you are a coder and you're looking at this, please don't come for me. This is definitely not the end all be all. So but hopefully this is a good starting place. And from here, I'm going to go into each one of these categories and kind of just show like a very quick, like, here's how you can have the code, run the code, cool, check, we're done. That way you have some starting point. One of the first things that you're going to need to write code, obviously, is a place to write it. There's a bunch of options out there. I'm using Visual Studio Code Editor, which is a Microsoft thing. I actually started out using Atom. Atom's free. Visual Studio Code is also free. Another one I've heard a lot about, which now I'm blanking on what it's called. I think it was like IntelliJ or something like that. IntelliJ might be a specific thing, but this JetBrains thing. There's a bunch of text editors in here. They're like per language. I guess IntelliJ is part of this. I'm not as familiar with this, as you can tell. But they have a bunch of like very different sort of just text editors that are like packed with stuff. These cost money. So if you're starting out, obviously don't do this, but it's interesting to know that it's there. I think actually IntelliJ is the JavaScript one, which is probably why. Oh no, that's not JavaScript at all. Anyways, it's a text editor and it's packed and it's got some really cool tools, and maybe someday TM you might want to invest in this. But I should also add that I've been a developer for 7 years at this point. I don't use this. My most recent job, none of the developers use this. We all used Visual Studio Code, which is free. So I think one of the most common things I encountered a lot when I was learning to code is people telling me, you know, you should have learned this language. Why are you doing that language? That language sucks. And it's really not any different than when you hear gamers sitting around saying like, oh, you're on the Xbox? Pfft, I'm on the PlayStation. PlayStation's better. Who fucking cares? I don't. And no one should. I don't know why people care. They get a little bit, you know, oh, this is better than that. And that's fine. Like, I'm glad that that person doesn't, like, is really, you know, passionate about their language. I don't care, and I hope that you don't either. It's something that you'll encounter a lot. People are going to tell you that you're doing, like, you picked the wrong language, you picked the lesser of the text editors. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Like, someday, like, way later in your career, you might decide to change for, you know, very educated reasons that matter to you. But when you're starting out learning, fuck what everybody says. I'm sorry to say that so bluntly, but there's going to be a lot of that. I could not get away from people telling me I had picked the wrong text editor. I had picked the wrong language to learn. Why was I learning on Windows and not a Mac? Blah, blah, blah. There's like millions of things that people are going to throw at you, and none of it matters because at the end of the day you're doing something, and it doesn't matter if they are either. They might be like a professional coder, but if they're telling you that what you're doing is stupid and wrong, they're really just kind of wasting their time. They're just being judgmental for whatever reason. It doesn't matter, and you're, you know, always welcome to take feedback from these people, but also remember that there's a ton of coders out there that think that what they're doing is the best way to do something. And what they miss out on, that you're not going to miss out on, is that they don't really have a chance to learn. When you, like, there's no end in learning when you're coding because shit's always changing. Like, let's see. Let's go to Node.js, nodejs.org. This is at version 18 now. And I think when I started, it was version 6 or 8. It's very different. It's just not the same at all. And as all of these things are constantly changing on their own, you know, I mean, people are changing these things, but, you know, it's not me, right? Like, I'm not changing Node, but I have to keep up with it because it's going to change. And so one of the most important parts of being a dev is always being open to learning more. So when people are telling you that you just picked a dumb language, period, that's not helpful. So just ignore that and, you know, pick whatever text editor you're comfortable with. I recommend the free ones. Like I said, I started with Atom. I was very happy with it. I switched over to Visual Studio Code later because it was actually just more convenient for the job that I was in. They had a bunch of packages with linters. A linter is something that tells you that you wrote something incorrectly before you actually like run the code and learn that you wrote it incorrectly. So that's kind of just a cool little helpful tool. Let me see if I can do that here. Code is here. So these like red lines, kind of just like spell check spell check, but for code. So that was one of the reasons why I switched over to Visual Studio Code. But again, it's really up to you. It doesn't matter. I do recommend something free. It's the easier way to get started. So whatever you're comfortable with, pick and go with that. Same with the languages. Whatever you're comfortable with, pick and go with that. At worst, you learn a language that you end up not using later. That's just still one more thing you could put on your resume. Even if it's like, oh yeah, this isn't really what I needed it for. You still learned it. And a lot of the kind of like lessons that you'll learn from writing Python will be applicable to JavaScript as well. And you know, you're not stuck. So there's really no bad thing to learn, in my opinion. One of the bigger problems that I encountered when I was learning to code is that I'm on a Windows machine. I don't know why, but it feels like code TM in general has always just existed for Mac users. I'm kind of, I think, exaggerating that point a little bit, but just to say that like it's a bit more difficult to code on a Windows machine. That doesn't mean I think you should switch. I'm a gamer. I'm not going to up and leave my very nice like Windows machine. I got my 3 monitors. I'm not going to go grab some Mac laptop for $1,000 and code on that. It's not going to happen. But because I'm a Windows gamer, I have to take a few extra steps to code on Windows. Windows comes with 2 things out of the box. It comes with Command Prompt and PowerShell. For the most part, PowerShell is just a boosted version of Command Prompt, and you won't really need that. One thing that I do recommend is whenever you are using them, run them both as administrator. You can either click Run as Administrator here, you can right-click Run as Administrator. I think Command Prompt would be the same way. Right-click, Run as Administrator. PowerShell's probably the default to run here. It has just about everything that Command Prompt has and more. So PowerShell default. But I think, and I guess there's kind of some barriers to this. If you can run with WSL, I would recommend doing that. So WSL stands for Windows Subsystem Linux. Linux is kind of just better. But I don't say better in like a, you know, obviously we just heard me go on this rant about like, you know, what's better, who cares? But Windows PowerShell just kind of wasn't really built the same way as Linux, and Linux was built as kind of like a more base for code. This is kind of harder for me to talk about because I don't know all the specifics. It does feel very factual even to me to say that Mac is better for coding than Windows. But again, we're not throwing out our Windows computers for this. We're just going to take a few extra steps. One of the prerequisites for WSL is, I don't know why this guide doesn't show it, but it's not just Windows 10. It's like Windows 10 Pro, I think, which costs money, and nobody has time for that. So, let me see. Do I have Windows? Yeah, I have Windows 10 Pro. So, one way to tell that is to go to your settings. So, right-click to your settings, and then go under About, and right here, Edition Windows 10 Pro. If you don't have Windows 10 Pro, you could buy it, but if you aren't in a position of buying it, that's okay. You're just going to have to take some other steps. You'll probably kind of stay with PowerShell, and that's also okay. There's nothing wrong with PowerShell if you can set up with using Ubuntu or WSL. This is probably better, but again, you got to do what you got to do. So the difference between these two is that here I can use a lot of like Linux specific commands. I'm trying to think of one, but of course I'm blanking. But there's this Linux. Oh no, I hit a weird button. Linux command line interface. So, okay, actually, in a quick side note, so CLI. Right here, CLI stands for Command Line Interface. That's going to be anything like this, or Command Prompt, or Windows Subsystem Linux. Or if you're on a Mac, it's just Terminal. If you're on a Mac, I think you'd hit the command key and a space bar, and you'd kind of get like this run thing right here where we type stuff, and you would just say terminal. I believe. It's been a minute since I've used a Mac, but however you normally would open your apps, you just look for terminal, and that's how you're gonna write code there, or not write code, but that's how you're gonna, you know, command line interface whenever you need to for a Mac. But okay, back to command line interface here in general. CLI is the acronym for that. It's used heavily. There will be a million acronyms that you see. Be prepared to Google all of them because there's acronyms everywhere. It's going to be confusing. Whenever I'm Googling acronyms specifically, I just kind of, so I would say CLI. What does CLI stand for in programming? You want to add that in programming part right here. If you don't, you might get something completely wonky. All right, so right here, we get the answer right at the start. Let's say I get rid of that. I might still get the right answer. Yeah, but there's going to be a lot. Let me think of what does CRO stand for? Contact Research Organization. Okay, what does CRO stand for? I don't think in programming is actually going to be, yeah, conversion rate optimization. See, so then this went exactly how I was hoping it would go for the sake of the example. As a programmer, I worked in conversion rate optimization for a number of years. That's what CRO was. But for someone else, CRO might be Contact Research Organization, or Contract Research Organization, right? So make sure to put in programming. I think actually doing that with CRO specifically was a long shot, but it worked out. We got there. So yeah, when you're doing Google searches and you're like, if it's an acronym, throw the word in programming after. If you're asking a specific question, you're always going to want to put, so let me pick this, how to sort arrays in whatever language you're doing it in, because there's different ways in all of them. So every time you ask a question, you're going to want to follow it up with your programming language. So that's a quick note on Google searches. Let's go back to command line now really quick. Linux command line is something that you're going to use a lot of. So you can grab a guide anywhere. It doesn't really matter specifically. Some of these are going to get complicated. I'd say you just kind of need some general things. The way that I learned this stuff was actually through, there's a dude that has a book called Learning Python the Hard Way. And there used to be a free version of this book, but there is no longer. Let's see. I don't think there is, at least. Oh. Is this free? Can I just go in here and do things? Oh, hell yeah. Okay. I'm going to put this in the comments. This is just fantastic. You can click through these. This is a free sample. Okay, it's a free sample with 8 exercises. Well, that has way more than that. Anyway, I'm not going to question it. There are things in here. You can click them. You can learn them. This is a fantastic resource. Here, yeah, so he uses the Atom editor and suggests that. Again, that or Visual Studio Code editor or whichever. But yeah, here he's going to go over some like Linux stuff. That's super helpful. I'm going to make sure to put this link in the description here so that you have that as a resource. But here are some of the most important things. I'll just cover like a couple. CD is your current directory. If you just say CD, nothing's going to happen though. Say CD, maybe it's change directory. It's probably change directory, but I don't really know what these things stand for. I just kind of like have at this point memorized what they do. So I'm going to change directory. I want to go up. So you do dot dot, so you can go up. I want to list stuff. That is absolutely not what that stands for, but I have never forgotten that. And if you ask me what it stands for, I can't tell you. I have absolutely no idea. LS lists stuff for me. List the stuff that's here, and it lists stuff. So change directory, go into that Hooly McKnight folder, and list stuff here. Cool. Other things. That's fantastic. Change directory and list stuff, valuable resources. But again, I guess list stuff isn't correct, but who cares? And yeah, there's some more things in here. I find that the things I use the most are change directory and list stuff, but you might use a number of things. And like I said, this course is how I learned those. But you can also just Google Linux command line interface things. Now, all of that is useless in PowerShell. Guys, not all of it. You can still you can change directory. Let me go to my H drive list stuff. Go to documents. Go to coding. You can also, oh, really quick, list stuff, CD bots. I'm autofilling that by hitting tab after I type in a couple of letters, and it kind of does the work for me. You can also, if you know where you're going without looking at it, you can just kind of like keep going in a single line. So I'm going to go to my Dina bot. There. So now I list stuff and I can see there's the folder bot and then the file Dina. Those things work here, but a lot of the other Linux commands won't work in PowerShell, which is at that point, if you are like, well, you know, I'm looking at a guide and it's using Linux, it says I need to do X command. One thing that you could just Google is how to blank in PowerShell. And hopefully that will help bridge some gaps. There's just going to be a small handful of extra Google searches if you're using Windows. That's okay. We accept that. It's much cheaper than buying a new computer. This guide, for example, going back here to install Linux on Windows, I'm going to put this in the comments too, but this is, I feel like, not a full guide. I went through this particular guide to try and reset up WSL, and it didn't quite work as expected. I got stuck right here at the first step. WSL came back as not a recognized command. Off the top of my head, I do not remember how I solved that. If I were to do something that's not a command, like let's say hello, that's not a command. You're going to get an error code. You just want to grab kind of the beginning of this, and you can copy it. That didn't work, so let me hit Control-C, copy it, and then go over here and Google it. Obviously, this is not going to come back with anything because no one's using the term hello. Yeah, so that's kind of just the step that you want to do. When you do something that doesn't work, whether you're following a guide or not, the next step, like you still want to keep following that guide to the best of your ability if you really believe that it's the guide that's going to work for you. And in that case, you have hit, say, a roadblock. Google that error that you get. And the thing about error codes is they can feel very stressful. But an error code, especially when you start getting a different error code, is progress. So if you have, well, I think one of the scariest things is when your code doesn't work and there's no error. So where do you start? How do you fix that? When you have an error code, you have a clue, and you get to investigate that. And a lot of times error codes can be frustrating. They don't have to be fun every time you see them. But in general, like, it's good to try and have a positive outlook on having error codes, because I can just tell you right now, you're going to get a million, an absolute million, an uncountable number of error codes. So I guess I lied, not an absolute million, but more. So many, uncountable. And that's like, if you're going to do code either as like a side hobby or as a job, that's the rest of your coding life. You will be getting error codes, and you will be reading them, and you will be Googling them, and eventually solving them. There's no shame in getting an error code, because it's going to happen. It happens to literally everybody. So if you get an error code, as much as you can, remember that this isn't you as a failure. You're not failing because you get an error code. That's just the next thing to investigate. It's a clue. So as much as you can kind of like have that with a good perspective in your mind, that will help going forward. That's one of the other things I remember struggling with a lot when I was learning code, was that I felt like I was failing every time I got an error code. And I no longer feel like that, because I realized, oh, that's my clue. Like, that's something for me to grab onto and figure this out. And the whole point for me of writing code is solving problems. So one of my favorite apps that I guess I can call it an app, but one of my favorite things that I've built is this Jackbox wheel. we're hanging out with my friends. We don't know what Jackbox game we want to play, but we want a wheel to figure it out. We don't just want to roll a dice or obviously we could Google this and put Jackbox games into a wheel, but we don't want to do that every time because we're lazy. We just want to go here and spin the wheel and have this pick the Jackbox game for us. Basically, I was presented with a very small problem. This small problem being, what game do we want to play? Okay, well, I can solve that. I'll make a wheel for us so that it picks the game for us and we don't have to pick. It's a very small problem, but it is a problem, right? And so kind of having that mindset of, I want to solve a problem, that's what this whole thing does. And along the way, I get a bunch of mini side quests of error codes. So as I'm going through and solving this problem, I'm getting a million error codes and I get to solve those problems, right? And it's one big quest with a bunch of little mini quests throughout. And so having that mindset is probably the healthiest way to go about this. Otherwise it can get pretty overwhelming. If you see all this red and you're like, red, bad, it feels bad. And that will happen sometimes, and that's totally okay. But just remember that that's the dream, is solving problems. So we've just got a new problem to solve. One more thing I want to touch on before I get into some of the specifics about how to just kind of bare bones run an app for each of the programming languages I mentioned earlier. I want to talk about W3 Schools. W3 Schools is a free resource online, and it has tutorials for everything. Absolutely everything. Everything I mentioned and so much more. So HTML and CSS and JavaScript right here, and then these can follow later if you're wanting to learn website stuff. If you're wanting to learn website stuff, learning jQuery and React are pretty important. JSON for sure, Ajax. I guess probably AngularJS as well, although I have to say I've gotten this far without learning that, but learn it anyways. Why not? Database stuff, SQL, MySQL, MongoDB, some database stuff. Anyway, they have just a ton of things here, and there's just so many helpful things. And they have all these other programming languages, right? So we talked about as well C++ and C#. We talked about Python. We talked about Java. All those things are here, and so much more. So yeah, just I could not recommend this enough. If you are like, all right, well, I'm gonna do web app or phone apps, so I would just go here, learn Java, and I would go through all this. It's a lot. You don't have to go through it all in one go. Or if you want, you can go through it just enough to feel comfortable, just diving in and trying to create an app, but keep this open. This is just one of the most fantastic guides, and I can definitely thank not only my early days, but I can continually thank W3 Schools for a lot of the things that I know and having helped me kind of figure out how to stumble through things. I wouldn't consider W3 Schools a deep dive, generally speaking, but it's a dive enough, and it's going to get you through. So this is absolutely fantastic. Take advantage of it. It's free and it's right here. I used it the most for JavaScript and SQL when I was starting out. Very, very helpful stuff. Yeah, so the other thing too that's really important is that you're going to probably keep coming back to either this or some other guide that you find, or just Google in general, even for basic things. So let's see, something that's kind of basic-ish. Okay, array sort. I used that earlier as an example, how to sort an array with JavaScript. I don't do this often enough to remember it, and I think a couple of times recently it's come up and I've been like, wait, how do I just dot sort? Like, how do I sort? And, kind of being unsure of that, how do I sort numerically? There's different ways to do these things. So I very recently came back here to W3 Schools and looked up this and found some more information on it, and it was super helpful. Again, I've been coding for 7 years at this point. There is no limit to when you come back to do this. It's not much different than when you're like out to dinner with friends, and we've all, we've all gone through high school or, GED or whatever route we went through, and, we can generally add probably and multiply. Like, we know enough, or we should, but then we're out at dinner, and who remembers that? I don't remember that. That's something I haven't used in years, or, whatnot. So I can't remember how to, do this multiplication. It maybe should be simple, but maybe it's not. It doesn't matter. You can pull out a calculator and, you know, put in some math, and that's okay. And the same way that we still do that, even though I think our our teachers all told us we wouldn't have a calculator on hand, or told us we would need to know these things. It's totally okay to not have things memorized. That's very normal. I don't have this memorized. I will forget this again, but it doesn't matter because anytime I'm coding, I'm at a computer. I probably have a connection to the internet. I'll just come right back here and I'll figure it out. You don't need to know everything offhand. The more you know, like, off the top of your head is, that saves you time and that's helpful, but that's something that's going to come over time. Don't stress too much about having all these things memorized. The much more important thing is knowing where to look. And I think that's something too, like if you're trying to go for a job for this, that's something as well that's really helpful to remember is if you are ever doing an interview and they ask you a question, you say like, I actually don't remember that specifically, but here's where I would look to find that. And that is very helpful. Learning, like, knowing how to code is not always knowing every little thing about it. There's so many things. If you ask me how many languages I've known and written code in, I don't know, like there's so many. How do I know all of these things? I don't. I just know where to find them. And that goes a lot farther than having things memorized. So, also as well, going back to this Node.js thing, Node.js has changed so many times since I've started. I have a lot of the basic things memorized, but I often go back and look it up just to make sure it didn't change. Because Node.js is different. So if Node.js is different, just because I think I know something doesn't mean it can't change over time. So it's much more helpful in every single way to just know where to find the information rather than to have all of that information on hand. You only have so much room for stuff in your brain. Save that for things like, how you're going to logically parse out this problem. Like, how are you going to go through, how are you going to get from point A to point B? Like, that's where you want to save all the space in your brain. You don't want to have a bunch of trivial information clogging up that space. We don't have time for that. We have Google for that. Alrighty, so the final piece of this puzzle is going through how do we run code once we have it? How do we run it in, on our computer? How do we test it? I've written this bot. How do I test that? How do I make this run on my computer? Like, I just have code. What do I do with it? How do I see it? And that is different for every language and for the type of I guess, app it is. So we'll go ahead and start with a web app using JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. This is a blank HTML page. Yeah, so we have a nice little blank HTML page. This is actually from my old website. One way to look at these kinds of things is, let's see, where are we at? Coding, Lily McKnight, files. We've got this older page. When you have your HTML page, you can right-click, open with, and grab your browser. I use Vivaldi instead of Chrome. It's Chromium based. It's empty, which seems unfortunate, but actually it's empty because it just actually is empty. So let's say I had written, this is a paragraph, and I hit save, and I go back here, I can refresh. It should work because it's using the same file. But it doesn't, which I find to be weird. Open with Vivaldi. Alright, well that's strange. Oh, well actually this is a very good opportunity. Oh, it's probably because this is, one of these things is hidden. Yep, this is hidden. Okay, so, but let's start with what I just did there because this is a side note, but you can right click. You should be able to right click. I can't right click. That's very silly. Control Shift I, or if you were on a page that was better than that one, Developer Tools, Inspect, that would work in Chrome as well, and probably a few others. But once you're in here, you can actually step around the elements and you see what they look like. So this is This is the problem right here, is this display none. But what you're seeing is the same as what we're seeing here. So this is the problem. Everything is hidden. That's a CSS thing. So I won't go into detail about like how to fix that, because again, that would be, you know, kind of more of a specific coding guide. But you know, if you're working on a web app, you can pull open the dev tools and inspect and check things out here. And that's a very helpful tool to have. So, but that is one way. That's a very, very baseline way to open up a browser, or excuse me, open up an HTML doc in your browser. Just find the file and right-click open. One of the things that this references is it references a specific style sheet. So it'll reference CSS that way. It also references a JavaScript sheet that way, and you could also just type in JavaScript as it is, like in here. So one of the things too is we do have a console log right here saying on load, this is the theme, and if we go back here and we look in the console right here, on load, there's the theme. Looks like it has some other errors, but we won't dive into that. But essentially that is how you could, on a very, very baseline level, look at a website and test kind of what you're doing. Later, going forward, you're going to want to host the website probably. I use AWS. I have a lot of opinions about Amazon, but I use AWS. AWS has a lot of cool tools. EC2 is a way to run a server. Route 53 is where I have my actual website set up in here. I have like hosted zones. There's a million guides on this. All right, so HuliMcKnight.com is a website that I own, and you know I've put in an IP address on this line, and it routes to my EC2 server where I have all my files stored. There are going to be specific guides on this. You just kind of want to look up host a static website with AWS. So you can Google that, and you're going to find a bunch of guides on that. And I do want to also add, I have a handful of guides for how to set up a server on Amazon EC2, which is going to be kind of an important part of that. So I'll put those guides down there as well. They're all from DigitalOcean, and I just find them to be fantastically helpful. I refer back to them every time I spin up a new website, which is more often than you'd think. So hooray for that. I am very much a fan of DigitalOcean, as I am, you know, of many things. There's a ton of good guides out there. If DigitalOcean isn't the one for you, don't worry about it. I will, side note, mention that actually hosting stuff on Amazon does cost money. My last month cost was $20. That is hosting my website and probably something else. I've got 2 instances running. Oh yeah, and then this other like server that I use to play around with to learn React Native. So that does cost money. I think like the first month you can get for free, but it's really general, and I think it depends on how often it gets used. Maybe it's the first couple of months, maybe it's longer. Who knows? I have no idea at this point. If there was a free trial, I'm so far past it I couldn't even tell you how long it lasts. But overall, the charges just don't really. They're worth it to me. But again, you can always go back to just looking at your files here without actually hosting the website. But in the future, if you do want to host a website, AWS is an option. Remember, there are others. I've been on AWS for so long. I'm very comfy with it. Yeah, okay. All right, moving on from that one. So that's how you would kind of look at your website code after you have it written. Let's talk about video game code. So with video game code, you can write some C++. In Visual Studio Code, you could just write that in there, and this is a guide which I will include below. I haven't actually done this myself, so I'm slightly less comfortable with it. But this is, looks like a pretty solid guide if you were to use VS Code on how you can, run a build task and kind of compile it and have it run. But again, this is this is here doing just basically text-based stuff in the terminal. That's a good starting point. I will definitely include this guide. I think that's fantastic. But another thing that I highly recommend is if you're trying to learn how to code a video game, specifically not just C++, but like a video game, is getting Epic Games Launcher and downloading Unreal Engine or Unreal Studio. Unreal Engine Studio. It's Unreal Engine. Unreal Engine is free. It's completely free to use. The limit basically does not exist until you start distributing a video game, which is so far down the line, we aren't worried about that. If you're not making money off of any video game that you've built here in Epic Games, then you really don't have anything to worry about. If you're going to start publishing it and distributing it, that's a different story. I cannot help with that one. I've never gotten there. But Unreal Engine here in the Epic Games Launcher is, like I said, absolutely free, and it's fantastic. This is what a ton of like actual professional like companies use. I used to work for a gaming dev company, and we did in fact use Unreal Engine for the main game that we were developing. Another example, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice was made in Unreal, and that game looks absolutely fantastic. There's probably a ton others. I don't even know where to start, but you can just use this in its entirety right here, right now. The only thing you have to have is a computer that can handle it. So there is that. But if you're, I feel like this might be a slight assumption, but I feel like if you're really into gaming and you're wanting to build a game, there's a higher percentage chance that you already have a gaming computer, which is, you know, a step in the right direction. If you can game, you can probably build games. That being said, if your computer can't quite handle Epic Games Unreal Engine, that's okay. There's other things. There's Unity is another super popular one. Again, when I worked for a game dev company, we also used Unity to build a game. Another example of a very famous game that built in Unity, Overcooked and Overcooked 2. And those games are fantastic. They're super fun. Let's see, there's also just kind of, I think there was, what was it, Game Visual Studio? No, not Visual Studio. Game Maker. You know, I can't remember what it was called, but there are, oh, Game Maker Studio 2. Game Maker Studio 2. There's a bunch of ways that you can make a video game. All of those are going to be supported by knowing C++ and or C#. Or actually, I shouldn't say all, a lot of them. Unity uses C# and Unreal Engine uses C++. A lot of these other things, I have absolutely no idea. But when you start diving into them and you kind of like get into the, you know, the development side, going through these apps, you'll have not only a way to visually see any code that you're touching in those languages, but of course you'll know what languages to use because it should say it somewhere. If it doesn't, you can always Google, let's see, what language does Unreal Engine use? C++, boom. And I think if we said Unity Engine, it would, you write code in C#, JavaScript, or less frequently, Boo. I've never heard of Boo in my life. There's always new stuff to learn, so that's cool. But anyway, yeah, so we do have, there's options, but when it specifically comes to making video games, I recommend just using one of these apps to actually build a video game in. That will help you take your code from just loose code that's written in here in, you know, some language to an actual physical like thing that you can look at, and that's what you want. Okay, so moving on from those two, we're going to go into software apps. So this is maybe not the best example, but I will use my Discord bot as an example. My Discord bot is not like, this is also using JavaScript, but it's not JavaScript that goes through like front-end website. So it's just kind of JavaScript that's getting run in a terminal somewhere, and it comes out as a bot that in here says, "Great job! You bought a new bra." Or here with roles, you know, as people, you know, react or unreact for certain roles, how they, you know, receive them. So let's say, for example, right now I have the Jackbox role. I'm going to click this Jackbox thing and I should lose the role after a second. I no longer have it. So I'll go click Jackbox again, and now I have that back. That kind of thing. So visually speaking, for this particular app, what I'm seeing is going through Discord. Now, if you're doing something like that, that specifically is going to involve kind of diving into like what type of app you want, how you want it displayed, and for that you kind of just want to do a Google search. So going back here, one thing I remember searching up recently is how to build a desktop app using JavaScript. So I picked JavaScript because that's the language I know the best. I think I used Electron.js. I could not tell you, excuse me, I could not tell you how specifically I ended up here, but this is where I ended up. I ended up using this Electron.js, and I built an app that helps my girlfriend and I pick a video game that we want. This is very similar to the Jackbox wheel. Pick a game, and then it picks our game. We can either go back or re-roll. I didn't like that one. Okay, Sea of Thieves. Well, I don't want that one either. ESO sounds good. We can go back and open more things up. It still really likes Overwatch. Anyways, so yeah, that, in order to actually have built that, I just simply Googled, and again, I hate to say that in such a general way, like, oh, I Googled, but, there's so many things you can do with code. You have to be very specific about your Google search and say, like, I want to do this. And so let's remember, like, the thing that I Googled, how to build a desktop app using JavaScript. I just need to say my goal, build a desktop app using JavaScript. That's important. Again, if you're doing things with a language, you always want to be putting the language that you're using. Maybe I would say Python. Then I'm not going to use Electron.js, which is what I used before. I'm going to use Python. There's a ton of different guides. There's no real way to know which one is the best one. Grab one. If it doesn't work for you, or you're like, this is confusing, I don't get it, try another. And there's no limit. At worst, like, you might even go through a few and be like, none of these worked. And or maybe none of them worked for me, or I didn't feel good about this. It didn't really get exactly what I wanted to do. It skipped some things. Like, so if I'm in here, installation pip, I don't know what pip is. Let's say I maybe entering that into my terminal isn't working. For example, I bet it wouldn't work here. Yeah, probably not. So if I'm stuck here at the first step, I might have to Google how to use pip. Let's say how to use pip in PowerShell. And I want to throw Python at the end just because. How to install packages with pip in PowerShell. So this is kind of like a step in the right direction. Someone has asked the question. I would read through this question, just make sure it is actually the problem that I'm having. And then, if so, then you can kind of dig into the answer. But yeah, it's going to happen a lot where you hit a guide and you have to like kind of spiral off and go through some other guide in order to make the first one work. That's super common. So yeah, okay, so specifically, yes, software apps, you would just kind of Google, sorry, we don't need that. You would Google the specific thing that you're wanting to do. I want to build a desktop app. If you want to run a Discord bot, how to run a Discord bot. I could say Python, I'm going to say JS. This first hit, this looks helpful, but not maybe to a newbie. So I would back out of it and look for something that's much more of a like step-by-step, like this is a how-to guide. If it loads. It might not load. Oh no. JavaScript Discord bot tutorial. I do like tutorials. Yeah, so this is a great walkthrough for how to get started, because in running a Discord bot, there's a couple sides to come from. You can't just, throw some code out and end up with, this Dina bot as a whole Discord user. There's some steps you got to go through first, and this guide touches on those. So this is super helpful. You also have this, like it gives you kind of a bare bones. Only thing I will note is that it looks like this guide's slightly out of date. If you're using newer JavaScript, because it depends on what you're using. If you look at mine, some of it's different. So client has like these intents that are needed on message create instead of on message. So there's some things that are slightly different, and you might end up with that kind of issue when you're looking at, how do I see when this was written? It does not show. Let's go up to the top. That I find to be extremely unfortunate. There isn't a date on, oh, there it is, okay. March 8th, 2021. So if you're wondering just how quickly things could change, it is currently December 12th, 2022. So it's been about a year and a half, and already this code right here is outdated. That being said, it's still helpful. It's a good place to start. So, you know, I would still kind of start here, and then as things aren't working, you can Google each error issue, and that's exactly how I, found out that my code was out of date. My code used to look more like that. And when I tried to run my bot, things didn't work. So I started Googling, and I found that they're using these intents now, gateway intent bits. I had never heard of that term before it came up a couple of days ago, or a couple of weeks ago, excuse me. And so that's okay. I learned something new. But, you know, I learned that by running this code, which did not work, and getting an error code, Googling the error code, and following that until I found, oh, okay, there's been some updates to Discord.js. Mine's now outdated. Just because something's outdated doesn't mean it doesn't get you in the right direction, at least to start with. Usually, you know, when things are updated, usually there's some documentation out there so that it's easy enough to figure out, okay, something's been updated on Discord.js's end, not my end, and now I need to update my code to match theirs. Okay, moving on from that, one of the ways that I have this run is actually through PowerShell. All right, Node is installed here. I don't actually want to run Node. Oh, Control C is a good thing to keep in your back pocket. Control C when you're doing command line stuff is a good way to just like quit. Like, get me out of here, you can just hit Control C. So if I was running Node, Dino.js, and she's running right now, so this is open because she's running, you can hit Control C to get out of that. One thing that you want to make sure, like if you want your bot to run without you having this open and having to basically have this just occupied and open, like the second you close this, the bot would stop running, right? So how do you run it without having this open? I use PM2. Let's say node PM2 home. Yeah, and go through this. NPM is a package manager. I don't know what the N stands for, but NPM is something that you're going to see come up a lot if you're doing stuff with Node. Maybe it's Node Package Manager, actually. I don't know. But you're going to see that come up a lot, probably. That or Yarn. Those are similar. They both help you install things. If you want to do a deeper dive into that, you can just Google NPM and kind of read up on that. But otherwise, it's just something that, like, you see it, and you're like, okay, I'm going to use NPM. You might have to install NPM if you haven't before. But anyways, so moving on. Yeah, you just kind of want to run things using PowerShell, but getting guides like this are going to be super helpful. I would just try to say like run node application in PowerShell. Node.js is probably what, if you used JavaScript to write this, Node.js is what you're going to want to use here to run it. Tutorial, Node.js on Windows for beginners. This might be pretty helpful, something to dive into. My goal in all this isn't to like give like specific answers, because I don't have specific answers, because I don't know specifically what you're wanting to do, but you know, just kind of showing some things that you could Google that would be pretty helpful and hopefully get you started in the right direction. Yeah, okay, so moving on from all that, I have one more thing to cover, which is if you want to build phone apps. If you want to build phone apps, I would encourage you to get Android Studio Editor. Okay, so Android Studio is an entirely free app built by Google. Well, I said built by Google. Yeah, built by Google. Yeah, it's totally free. That being said, I did have to upgrade the RAM on my computer when I was using this first a few years back. It can be kind of beefy. The explanation I got for that is that this is one of the things that Google built in like their free explore, learn fun things time, and kind of on the side, and so it wasn't optimized super incredibly. That might all be very different now. I'm not sure. I haven't used this in a long time, so this isn't where my career took me. But Android Studio is similarly to Unreal Engine, completely free to use. The only time I think when it becomes like, oh, you need money, is actually when you start making money. So if you're not publishing this like for money, I think you should be fine to just kind of use it entirely freely and build essentially whatever you want. But this also gives you a very good way to, like, you have code written. I'll look back at this picture actually. You have code written here, and you can see it on the right over here. And that's an absolutely fantastic way to visually see what you're writing and the effect. Like, you know, you're writing code, you want to see what it looks like. That's what this does. So if you're going for a phone app, I recommend starting here. And it'll also kind of like guide you through a bunch of like languages that you'll need. Java is going to be used a lot here. Python could be used. Kotlin is another language here. I don't know anything about Kotlin. I have stumbled through Java a little bit, but again, you know, Android Studio is kind of where to start. Let's see, how to build simple app in Android Studio. So you could Google that, and here you go, build your first Android app in Java. And this will guide you through a very simple thing. You have install Android Studio, create your first project, explore the layout, add color, resources, things. So this is a cool guide. There's so many guides out there. It just depends on what you're wanting to do. But yeah, so just kind of to recap really quickly, if you're doing websites, you can actually just straight up open the file here by just doing right click, open with browser. If you're doing video games, I recommend doing Unreal Engine or Unity. There's also other things out there like Game Maker Studio. If you're doing software apps, you're going to have to kind of Google the more specific thing that you're wanting to do. Like, I want to, you know, run a Discord bot. And then if you're doing phone apps, I recommend starting with Android Studio. If you ever want to switch to iOS stuff, you can definitely do that in the future, but this would be a very good start, and it's totally free. So those are my general recommendations for that. Yeah, but moving forward, you know, there's gonna be a lot of Google searches. You know, you'll find a lot of resources, like W3 Schools is the one that I found that you'll want to have kind of in your back pocket to refer back to often. And yeah, just if there's anything that you think I missed that you're like, you know, man, as a new dev, like nobody has any guides on this, I don't know how to do, you know, XYZ, like if there's any like big questions that you have where you're like, you know, I don't know how to do general thing, nor do I know what to Google. Please let me know in the comments. I'd be super curious to know, and then, you know, I can add and update this later. But kind of what my goal in all of this was just to kind of give you a starting point for like something that you could Google and something that you could start searching depending on what it is that you're wanting to do specifically. Yeah, but again, there's so many things out there. It can be really overwhelming. If you have any, like I said, questions, feel free to ask them. For specific questions like how do I sort arrays in JavaScript, I recommend Googling those. I think that's just the fastest way. For the comments here, I would definitely love questions like, how do I search for this? Like, how do I, you know, do blank? And, you know, unfortunately, the thing is that, like, I think there's not a lot of guides on first steps sometimes, because a lot of times when we get past first steps, we forget, which is exactly why I can't really give an example of a question, you know, I guess besides just like, how do I run an app? That was something that I struggled with a lot when I was first starting. I had no idea. And it didn't even really occur to me until I was talking with my girlfriend about it the other day. That was like one of the biggest struggles I had. What language do I pick? I picked a language because it was the one I found a guide in. And, you know, that ended up kind of defining, like, you know, where I went from there. Not that that matters, like you can always change that at any time, but you know, I fell in love with the language that I started with and went from there. But like maybe it would have been different if I had been able to find guides in other languages, or maybe it would have been different if I had known what language was good for what. Um, you know, there's so many things that I didn't know starting out, and I'm hoping that I can help and be a resource for very general questions like that to help you get started and start Googling the right things that will work for you. So if you have any questions, again, please drop them in the comments. I really appreciate that. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful. And just kind of remember that, you know, um, whichever direction you're going in doesn't matter. You're going to be learning either way. Um, but whichever direction you're going in, just be proud that you're going in a direction and you're doing things. Like, this is a really cool thing to take up. And yeah, I hope that all of this is super helpful.